what Jenkins is, you have to see it for yourself. So let's go ahead and have a look at Jenkins. Alright, so we are here on the Jenkins website with the installation instructions for Jenkins. There's a couple different options that they give you here. You can either install it directly onto the OS, or you can run Jenkins in a container environment such as Docker or Kubernetes. The suggested method is to use Docker, so that's what we'll be doing. There's instructions on the Jenkins website how to do that, but I have a more summarized version of those instructions in my GitHub in the description below, so make sure to check that out if you want to follow along. I'm going to pull that up right now.
Your turn to
And you can see that there's 3 major steps for the installation. The first step is
5
to
seconds
build the
remaining.
Docker image. The next one is to create a network called Jenkins, and then to launch the container. I have commands for Mac OS, Linux, and Windows, so you can use either one. So let's go ahead and do this. The first command is going to build the Docker container using the Docker file that I have here. And just to check it out, you can see it's just like any other Docker file. This one's pulling from the Jenkins repository, and you can see it's also installing Blue Ocean. Blue Ocean is a popular
Your
add-on
turn to
for
pick.
Jenkins. It makes your CI/CD pipelines look a lot nicer and just a little bit easier to manage and troubleshoot. We'll be having a look at Blue Ocean later on in this tutorial. So let's go ahead and pull up a prompt here, and I'm going to start off by cloning my repository here. And once I've cloned it, I'm going to hop into that directory so I can create the Docker image. And I'm going to do that with my docker build command. And you can see that it's building the container. And it should just take a few minutes for you, depending on the speed of your internet connection. It's just going out and grabbing the Docker image of Jenkins, and then running apt update install and installing a couple plugins. So once that's done, I'm going to clear the screen to make this a little easier to see. And the next thing I'm going to do is Docker network create Jenkins. And you can see I'm getting an error that the network already exists. I already created this network, but you should be able to see it. And the way to verify that is just through a Docker network ls command. And you can see I have this Jenkins network already created. So I can move on to the last step, which is actually running the container command. And again, this is in my GitHub below. I'm going to copy that over from my other screen and paste it in here. And this is just going to start the container, and you can see exactly what it's actually specifying here. You can see that it's specifying the network of Jenkins. There's a couple environment variables here specifying the location of the certificates, the TLS version, and a couple mapped volumes, and which ports should be published. So let's go ahead and do a Docker PS, and you can see that the Docker container is now running, and it's listening on port 8080. So let's go ahead, pull up a browser, and see if we can get to this website. Alright, so I have it pulled up here, and you can see that it's on this unlock Jenkins command. This should be the first thing that you see when starting a new Jenkins instance. And basically what it's telling you is you need to put in the administrator password, and that password is going to be at this location when you first install Jenkins. Now, since we're running this on a Docker container, we're going to have to use the docker exec command to cat out this file. So I have that command saved in my GitHub, so let's go ahead, copy it, paste it into the terminal here, and it spits out my password. So I'll grab that, put it in, and we're in. Now we're at a screen where we can install Jenkins. I'm going to install with the suggested plugins, and this should go pretty quickly. It's just grabbing the most popular plugins that Jenkins uses, such as Ant and Gradle, couple other things here. Let's just wait for this to finish, and then we're going to set up our user account. All right, so we're at create your first administrator. Go ahead and put in your details. I'm going to put in my details now, and then hit save and continue. All right, for this instance configuration, you can just leave at default and hit save and finish, and start using Jenkins. All right, so this is the Jenkins UI in all its glory. I know it's not a lot to look at, but it does get the job done. Let me zoom in a little bit here to make things a little larger and easier to see. And let's go over what these items do. The first item here is your breadcrumbs, so it'll make it easy to navigate through Jenkins and go down levels, something we're going to be using a lot when we're administrating our jobs. The next thing is new item. This is where you create your projects and pipelines. We're going to be going into it shortly. The next thing is people. This is where you administrate user accounts. Build history gives you a history of all your jobs that have been run. Manage Jenkins has all your management stuff. This is where you set up agents. This is where you install plugins. We're going to go in here as well, and I'll show you the most popular menus that you would be using as a Jenkins administrator. The My Views and New View is just a way to organize your jobs and have things display nicely. Blue Ocean is a popular plugin for Jenkins that enhances your CI/CD pipelines. Once we have our pipeline created, we'll go into Blue Ocean and check out how it looks in Blue Ocean versus the regular Jenkins UI. For now, let's go into Manage Jenkins. And you can see that this brings up quite a few different options. Basically, these are all your options for managing Jenkins. So at the very top, you can see there's some notifications here. Let's go over them. The first one is just saying that building on the built-in node can be a security risk. This is just letting us know that we don't have any agents set up. So if we were to make a Jenkins pipeline, it would be running on the Jenkins master, which is not recommended. We're going to be setting up some agents, so this is something that we can ignore for now. The next one here is it's just a warning about one of our plugins. It basically wants us to go in and update our plugin. So we'll just ignore that one for now, and when we get to the plugin section, we'll go ahead and fix this. Let's go over the main items that you would be using as a Jenkins administrator. So I'll scroll down here and get everything in the view. Alright, so let's see if we can speed run through the most popular items here. The first most popular one is Configure System. This is going to give you a lot of information about your Jenkins server and let you set some global parameters in regards to your Jenkins server, so you'll probably spend a little bit of time in here. The next popular one is Manage Plugins. As a Jenkins administrator, you're going to be spending a lot of time in here because Jenkins is a beast when it comes to plugins. And over time, companies install plugins, developers install plugins, and different plugins break each other. When you upgrade Jenkins, plugins break. So being a Jenkins administrator, you're going to be dealing with plugins a lot. So we're going to be spending quite a bit of time in here in this lab, and I'll show you how to administrate plugins. The next one is Manage Nodes and Clouds. This is where you're going to go ahead and set up your agents as well as clouds like Kubernetes, Docker, AWS. Anything to do with agents will be in here. The next section is the security section. A lot of these are pretty obvious. You can configure global security settings, you can manage users, and then you have managed credentials. The managed credentials is probably the least obvious one in this list. This is where you would store SSH keys or API tokens. Now, you don't have to use Jenkins as your credential manager. You could use something like AWS Secrets if you want. But Jenkins does have a built-in credential manager, so go ahead and use that if you would like. Down below, we have some other pretty obvious things. You can get some system information about Jenkins. There's some logs, some load statistics. I don't spend a lot of time here. At the bottom here, you have a couple tools, mostly for troubleshooting Jenkins, but one that you may run into that you need to use is prepare for shutdown. So you would use this in a situation where you need to take the Jenkins server offline to perform some sort of maintenance. You wouldn't want to just go ahead and reboot the Jenkins server or just shut it down, because you would be interrupting current jobs that are running. So what you would want to do is set it to prepare for shutdown, and what that'll do is make it so Jenkins doesn't start any new jobs, it just finishes the jobs that are currently running. Alright, so now that we know the main management features of Jenkins, we're ready to create our first project. So let's go up to Dashboard and then New Item. And in here you can see there's quite a few different options, but the ones that you're going to be sticking with mostly is Freestyle Project and Pipelines. Pipelines are the more advanced style where you use the Groovy script. We're going to be getting into that later on in the video, but Freestyle projects are also pretty popular, and they're a great way to start learning Jenkins. And if you're administrating Jenkins servers on the job, doing any type of consulting, you're going to run into freestyle projects, so it's going to be something you want to learn. So let's go ahead and create one. We'll have to give it a name. Now, the first thing I can say here is do not create a name that has spaces in it. And the reason for this is because in the back end, Jenkins is actually going to be creating a folder based on this job. And it's going to be something that we have a look at so you understand the file structure of a Jenkins server. But for now, just make sure not to use spaces and use something like underscores or dashes instead. So I'm going to call it my first job. Make sure Freestyle Project is selected and hit OK.
Kakek moyang itu juga dong.
Tapi gigi kakek.
Gak usah khawatir. Poliden Adhesive membuat Anda bisa menggigit kuat dan
Alright, so we are in the project settings of our first build that we're creating here. Let me take you through the category of settings that you're gonna run into here. The first one is just a couple build options at the top. You can ignore those for now. It's gonna be something that you get into as you get more advanced into Jenkins. The next one is source control management. So you're almost always going to be using something like Git, and then you just put in your repository URL. Jenkins is going to go ahead and pull that repository down into your workspace and use that code. The next one is your build triggers. So your build triggers is what is triggering your job. So popular options here is to have GitHub send a webhook to your Jenkins server. Now this can be a little more difficult if your Jenkins server is behind a firewall. You'll need to either open ports or use some sort of proxy service to make sure that webhook gets to your Jenkins server. Another way to sort of cheat the system is to use this polling SCM, and what this is going to do is it's going to have Jenkins reach out to GitHub and just check periodically. So that's one way to get around if your Jenkins is behind a firewall and cannot receive webhooks. Another option is to just build periodically. And this is just the same thing as setting up a cron job. You just set a schedule and your Jenkins build will run based on that schedule. For build environment, a popular option is to delete the workspace before the build starts. This just makes sure that you have a clean environment before your build runs, and it deletes any artifacts that have been left over by Jenkins that were created during the last run of the job. And then scrolling down, we have the build. These are your build steps that your build is going to go through, and then we have our post-build actions, and these are just things that are going to happen when your build is complete. So some popular options here might be to send an email notification, and if you had the Slack plugin, you could send notifications to Slack. So let's go over to build, and the most popular one that you're going to use is just to execute a shell. So this is just like bash scripting. So whatever we run here, the Jenkins server is going to run within its workspace. So the simplest thing that we could do here is just echo hello world, hit save, and then build now, And this is going to run our job. And we got an error here, so let's go check that out.
Indeed.
And it failed because I opened that Git repository thing. So let's go back to our project, go to configure, and I left this empty. Let's just go ahead and set it to none, and that should fix the error that we have there. So let's go ahead and save it, hit build now, and now we can see that the job has run successfully, so we can click into it, and there we go, it echoes hello world. So that's your simple hello world Jenkins build. Let's go back into the build. Just go up to back to my project and then configure. And we're going to do something a little more complicated than just echo hello world. Let's get into the available environment variables. So if you click here, just open it in a new tab, you can see all the environment variables that are set for Jenkins that you can use throughout your build. And you're going to be using these variables quite a bit whenever you're creating jobs. The most popular one that I like to use is build_ID, and this gives you the current build ID. I always use this when I'm versioning my Docker images that I spit out from my build. I like to specify the build ID, and then that way I know which build actually built the image. So that's a popular one that I like to use. Another popular one is the build URL. So you can see it here, and you can see it gives the URL for the build. So that's a good one. So let's go ahead and put these into our job. So to use the Jenkins variable, I usually just go echo, and we can see the build ID of this job is $, and then I usually throw it into these two curly brackets, and then I go build_ID, and then because we can, we'll go the build URL is, and then we'll put the build URL. Go ahead and save it, and then build now.
Put your lights out.
And we can go into our job, and depending where you click the icon in Jenkins, it's either going to bring you to this screen or bring you right into the logs. So let's go into console output, and there you can see that it is saying hello world because we have that at the start of our job, and then the build ID is 3. And then the build URL is here. Now, one thing that you may notice is it's spitting out everything twice. To explain that, this is the actual command it's running with this plus sign, and then the next line is just the standard out of the console. So since we're echoing hello world, that's sending standard out, so that's the standard out. So that's why you're seeing everything twice in this job. Looking at this build URL, so that basically just brings us here. So this is a really good one if you're sending Slack notifications. You can send the build URL to one of your developers, letting them know that the build is done, and then they can click it and see everything that happened. So if you click it, you see it brings us here, gives us all the information about the build. Okay, so let's go back to our project and go to configure. So the next thing that I want to do here is just show off the workspace. So if we go ls, this is just going to send the ls command to Linux. I'm actually going to go lsltr, and this should show all the files within the current workspace. Now, since we don't have any files, this probably won't output anything. So let's create a file, and we'll go echo 1234. And then we will send the output to a file called test.txt, and let's do an ls after that. We'll hit save, hit build now, and job number 4 is done. By the way, you can see there's 2 different links here. This one brings you to the main build page. This one brings you directly to the console output. So I always hit the check marks or the X's. So let's hit this. You can see that it ran the LSLTR first. There was 0 files, and then you can see that it echoes 1, 2, 3, 4 out to the file, and now we have that test.txt. Now if we go back to our project, you can see we have this workspace option, and if we go into workspace, you can see that that test.txt file exists. And there you go, click it, you can see 1, 2, 3. Now just for science, let's go ahead and run the build again. And it's now done, and if we go there, this time you can see on the first LSLTR that the file already exists. So basically what this means is we are not clearing out our workspace, and the files from the previous build are already in our directory. So if we go back to our project, we can change that by going delete workspace before build starts. And you can see here that you can add patterns and delete specific files. I'm just going to delete everything, so we'll just leave the defaults, hit save, hit build now. The job is complete. Go in there. Now you can see the first LS shows that there's 0 files, then we create the new file. Perfect. Now another thing that I would like to show you before we get into more advanced builds is the actual file system of Jenkins. So to do that, let's hop into the terminal, and I'm going to run a command here to get into the actual Docker container. So it's just docker exec -it, the Docker container name, and then bash. This will give us a bash shell into the container. And now we're on the actual Jenkins master. We're just in the root folder. So we'll want to go into the Jenkins folder, and we actually specified it in our docker run command here. So it's this volume that we mounted. So var/Jenkins home. So we'll go in here and do an LSLTRA. Quite a bit of files and directories here. The one that we're interested in is workspace. So we'll clear the screen and then go into workspace. And now if I do an LSLTRA, you can see that we have a folder here called my_first_job. So this is the job that we created. So whenever you create a build, it's going to have its own workspace under a folder of the job name. That's why you don't want to create spaces. And you can actually go in here and you will see all the files in here. So we can see our test.txt and cat it out, and there you go, 1, 2, 3, 4. So actually SSHing into the Jenkins machine or doing a docker exec into the container and having a look at the file system is something you're going to do quite a bit with Jenkins, especially when you're troubleshooting builds and jobs. Sometimes it's a lot easier to actually just go into the file system of the Jenkins server and have a look there. So a really great troubleshooting tool. Let's actually go back to the Jenkins home folder, so we can actually just go cd ~sign, and that should bring us here. If you do pwd, you can see we're in the Jenkins home folder, and if we look at the files again, you can see that there's other folders in here. So there's actually quite a bit of troubleshooting you could do within the file system. You can see that this plugins folder, this would be where you would have all your plugins, the updates folder where all the updates go, and then you can see there's a couple like XML files for the Jenkins configuration as well as logs. So this is a good place to go to troubleshoot your Jenkins master if you need to. Now that we've seen the file system of Jenkins, let's hop back into the Jenkins console, and I'm going to go back to the dashboard. And you can see that we have this job coming up here nicely, and you can see there's a couple things here. You can run the job. It tells you when it last successfully ran, when the last failure was, and the duration that it took the job to run. Now, if we were to create some new jobs, they would show up here as well. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to go new item. And what we're going to do for this one is we're going to clone down a repository and run a Python script. So we'll call this one my Python job.
I'll sort this.
Jamuran, cepat obati dengan Canison Pro. Kelarin jamur kulit like a pro.
Hit OK. And I'm going to go to this source control management, click get, and put in my GitHub repository. So you should do the same if you're following along. There's a Python script in this repository that we're going to run. And you can see there's credentials here. Now this is a public repository, so we don't need any credentials for cloning it down. But if this was a private repository, you would need to select your credentials or go ahead and add them. So if you're using a private repository, go ahead and make sure you're using credentials for that. But for us, we're okay. So let's head down to the bottom, and we're going to execute a shell. And what we want to do here is I just want to see which version of Python is running. And actually, one quick troubleshooting step I want to run is let's just see if Python is installed. Hit Python on the Jenkins server, and you can see that command not found. So let's try just Python 3. And we can see that Python 3 is installed. So let's go ahead and go to our job and make sure we use Python 3. And then we want to run our script called helloworld.py. And I believe that's what it's called in our repository. Yes, helloworld.py. So let's go ahead and run that one. Go ahead and save it and hit build and check out the job. And there we go. We can see everything that it did. So you can see that it went out to my GitHub repository. It cloned everything down, and then it ran Python 3 hello world, and we got the output of our script. So something as simple as this is actually quite powerful. Instead of us having to log on to a server to run a Python script and make sure we have SSH to the server to make sure we can run the script, we can just create a Jenkins job, hit a button, and we'll know that it runs. We can also set up triggers for this job to be triggered, like webhooks, or when a repository is updated, as well as sort of like a cron schedule. And we'll also always get a history of when that script was run, as well as full log output. So this is just something that you can tie your Python scripts to, and then just sort of keep track of whenever they're run. I also love doing this with Ansible and running Ansible playbooks. Instead of logging onto like a server and having someone run the Ansible playbook, I just set up a Jenkins job to run the playbook, and then you have a full history of whenever that playbook was run and if it was successful or not. Alright, so now that we have the basics of creating builds with Jenkins, let's get into more advanced topics like setting up agents and then building pipelines using the Groovy syntax. So I'm going to go back to the dashboard and then manage Jenkins, and then manage nodes and clouds. And then on the left hand side there's two main options. There's the new node and configure clouds. So if you go to new node, this is how you configure a permanent agent. Basically this would just be any sort of like Linux or Windows server that you have that is sort of always available. You set it up as a permanent agent, and Jenkins just connects to it via SSH and then distributes the jobs to it. Now in my opinion, this is sort of the older, more deprecated ways of creating agents, what people are usually doing now is configuring clouds. So if you go to configure clouds, this is how you set up agents using cloud platforms such as Docker, Kubernetes, AWS. So now that we're in here, we can see that there are no current cloud implementations available to us right now unless we go to the plugin manager. And that just leads us to the plugin manager. So we'll go there. And you can see that it's filtering on cloud providers here, and this is basically just a list of all the cloud providers that you can use for your agents. Let's go ahead and install Docker, but if you're interested in Kubernetes or using AWS, you could use those. So I'm just going to do Docker, and I'll say download now and install after restart. And then it's going to go through everything. These look like just the first plugins that I installed during the setup. Down at the bottom here you can see Docker, and it'll be activated during next boot. So I'm going to go ahead and click this, which will restart the Jenkins server. Alright, once the Jenkins server has restarted, you should be asked to sign in again. So you can just sign in, and then you'll want to go over to Manage Jenkins. And we should be able to go to our plugin manager and see that Docker is installed. If we go over to the install tab here, we can see that everything to do with Docker has been installed. And if we go back to dashboard, manage Jenkins, manage nodes and clouds, then configure clouds, we can see that we have adding Docker as an option. So we'll go ahead and add Docker, and I'm going to hit Docker Cloud Details here. And there's a couple things that you need to do to set up Docker. The first thing is you need to set the URI of the host that is running Docker. So if you wanted to run Docker within the Jenkins, you could just use like 127.0.0.1 and then the port for Docker. But if you want to run it remotely, then you would put in the IP address of the remote server. Now I'm running Docker Desktop on my local PC here, so I don't want the Docker to run within the Jenkins master. I want it to run within my actual PC that's running Docker Desktop. So there's a couple things that we need to do here. And there's actually a really good Stack Overflow article that outlines how to do this. I'll put it in the description below, and I also have details in my GitHub how to do it, and you can just follow along here on how to do it. So what I first want to do is launch a container running the Alpine SOCAD image. So I'm going to copy this command over from my GitHub. And put it in, and this should start up a container that's going to help proxy the connection from our Jenkins master container over to our local host here. So you can see that the container is up. I'm going to grab this container name, and I'm going to do a Docker inspect on it. And what I'm interested in here is the IP address of the SOCAD container. And it's right here, the 172.19.0.3. So I want to forward my connections for Docker to this IP address. So let's go in here and we'll go TCP. Throw in that IP address, and then it's going to be port 2375. And then I'm going to hit enabled and test connection just to make sure that everything goes through okay. And you can see that it has connected properly. Now if I put something incorrectly here, like the wrong IP address, you're probably going to get a connection error like the one that's popping up here, and you'll just have to take whatever comes up here and go show details and troubleshoot it. Go to Google, check to see what people suggest, but most likely it has something to do with routing. Now let's go ahead and change this back to 3, and then just have it test, and then go ahead and hit save. And that'll bring us back here. Let's go back to manage nodes and clouds, back to configure clouds, and we now have our Docker cloud details set up. But now what we want to do is create a Docker agent template. So I'm going to hit this here and then hit add Docker template.
It's not time yet.
And there's a few things that you need to set up here. The first one is the label, and what labels are used for is for the master to use to determine which agent should run the build. So it should be something descriptive about the agent. I'm just going to call it docker-agent-alpine. And then I'm going to say that this should be enabled. Make sure that you do the same if you're following along. And then I'm going to take this label and just give it the same name as the agent template. And then this is the important part. This is the actual Docker image that you're going to be using. I'm going to be pulling one from Docker Hub, and it's going to be a Jenkins agent image running Alpine with JDK 11. Now, if you want to use your own image, you can point to it on Docker Hub, or you can set up a private repository. You'll just need to make sure that you put in your credentials so the Jenkins master can authenticate it to it and pull down the Docker image. Now for some container settings, we can leave that as default. Instance capacity, this is basically how many agents it's going to actually spawn. So you're going to want to set this to a number. I'm going to keep it really low for now, just because if you run into any issues, you might be spawning lots of agents, and you don't really want to overwhelm your system. Another really important field for us to fill here is the remote file system root. This is basically where your workspace folder is going to get created. This is your Jenkins home folder. So I'm going to call it /home/Jenkins, as this is the default that you should be using for all your Jenkins agents. Now if we scroll down, I believe that's everything that we need to set here. Let's go ahead and hit save. And let's go back to our dashboard. And let's go to my first job, configure, and what we'll want to do here is select this restrict where this project can be run, and then we're going to say Docker agent alpine. Let's just select this one. I'm getting a notification that this doesn't exist, this label doesn't exist, but sometimes it's just Jenkins causing trouble. You can see that the autocomplete had a space in it, so when I removed the space, that seemed to fix it. Also, sometimes if you go in and out of the job, that will fix it as well. So go ahead and hit save, and now when we build, it should run the build on our Docker agent. So I'll go build now. And you can see that it's looking for an agent that has the label Docker Agent Alpine. Looks like it's still looking for it. So let's go ahead and troubleshoot this. Make sure that this is the right label. I'm going to open up another tab here and just go to configure. Oh, go to dashboard actually. And then manage Jenkins, nodes, configure clouds. Take a look at our agent template. We can see that's the correct name here. And it looks like it's enabled, so it should be good. And if we go back, back to here, go to cloud details. Let's go ahead and test the connection. The connection's working good, so everything here should be working fine. Let's go back into the job, and it looks like I was just being a little bit impatient as I was recording here. The agent picked it up and ran the job. If we run in here, we can see it was building on the Docker remotely on this agent that it created, and the job completed successfully. And we can also go here, built on Docker, and then it tells you everything in regards to Docker. Now let's go ahead and have a look at our other job that we created, and you can see it's this Python job. So what would happen if we went in here and restricted it to our Alpine image? Let's go ahead. And I think that'll fix itself if we just hit build now. Give it a minute to build, go back into configure, and I guess I just didn't read it correctly. It's saying that it does match it. So let's go back, and you can see that it did not run successfully. So let's have a look at why. And you can see that it checked out the code, but it couldn't run the Python command because Python 3 isn't available. So the reason for this is because that agent template that we created is just pulling down a Jenkins image from Docker Hub that doesn't have Python installed. So what you would probably want to do is create your own image, and that's exactly what I did. And I have one available on Docker Hub that you guys can use as well. So let's go back to Configure Clouds under Manage Jenkins. And we're going to set up a second agent and give it a new label. And then this second agent is going to run all our Python builds. So let's go to Docker agent templates. We have our first template here. I'm going to take the first part of this label, then scroll to the bottom and go add Docker template. And then I'm going to give it a similar label, but instead of saying Alpine, I'm going to say Python. Make sure it's enabled. Same name as my label. And then for the Docker image, I'm going to use my Docker image that I created from Docker Hub. So it's just DevOps Journey 1 / my Jenkins agents :Python 1. And this is what the Docker file looks like if you're interested. Now I'm just going to complete the other settings here. So instance capacity of 2, and then home / Jenkins for the remote file system. That should be enough to get us started. So I'll go ahead and hit save.
Here we go.
And then let's go to our dashboard, go into our Python job, configure it, and instead of using just our Alpine Docker image, we're going to use the label of Docker agent Python, which has our Python image.
I'll sort this out.
So we'll save that, and we will run it.
I'll sort this.
And there you go. If you're patient enough to watch, you can see that
For your troubles.
it selected the agent. Let's just go ahead and see.
Indeed.
And there we go. The Python script ran successfully on our Docker
You're
agent
getting me
that had
blood
Python
now.
installed on it. And there's actually a bug in my script that I didn't notice, but maybe some of you guys did. When you run Python hello world, it's saying hell world instead of hello world. So let's go ahead and fix that. And one thing that we can add into our build is to have them triggered automatically. So I'm going to go here, and I'm going to configure, and in our build triggers, I'm going to say pull the SCM. Pull SCM is a way to have your Jenkins master monitor the GitHub repositories and just check for any changes. It's more simple than setting up webhooks, especially if your Jenkins master is behind a firewall. So that's the method we're going to take here. And I'm going to paste in a schedule here. So it's */5****. So this is very similar to setting up a cron job. What this */5 means, it's going to do it randomly every 5 minutes. And this is a best practice with Jenkins because you don't want all your Jenkins jobs going out once per minute all at the same time. This just helps the Jenkins master distribute when the jobs go out and look at their GitHub repositories. So we're going to keep it as is there. Go ahead and hit save. And then I'm going to go into my GitHub here, and I'll have a look at this script. And I can go ahead and easily fix this just in GitHub. Change it to Hello World. And go ahead and commit the change. And then I'm going to go here and just wait for the build to trigger. I have it running like randomly once every 5 minutes, so it should trigger here within the next 5 minutes. I'm just going to go ahead and speed up the video. Alright, so the job has completed, and you can see, if we go in here, you can see at the very top that it was started by an SCM change. So this build was triggered automatically when we did a commit on our repository, so we didn't have to go in and press the build button. It just went ahead and ran the script. So something that you can add to any of your repositories if you want the build to trigger when a change is made. Okay, so far in this course we've learned how to install and set up a Jenkins master as well as Jenkins agents. We've also been over how to set up a freestyle project and create basic builds. The next thing we're going to have a look at is setting up CI/CD pipelines using the Groovy language. Now, to get started with this, all you have to do is go over to New Item, and then instead of going Freestyle Project, you create a pipeline. So we'll call this My First Build Pipeline. And we'll go ahead and hit OK. Okay, so this looks very similar to what we've seen before with the Freestyle Project. But if you scroll down, you'll notice that you don't have a lot of the options that you did before, and that's because they're all going to be built into this pipeline script, which we need to define down here. Now, there's two main ways that you can get started with doing this. The first one is you can just create your pipeline script directly into the Jenkins UI, or the second option is to use what's called a Jenkins file. And that's the preferred method. You just have a Jenkins file in your source repository, and you point this pipeline over to that Jenkins file, and it takes in your pipeline script there. We're going to start off just using this pipeline script, but then later on in this video, we'll check it into our source control and have Jenkins check it out from there and run the pipeline that way. Now, to get started here, I'm going to head on over to my GitHub repository. And in there I have this Jenkins file.template. So I'm going to take this, copy it, and put it in here. And this is a good basic template that you can start off with for all your projects. And if we just scroll to the top, you can see that it's got some nice syntax highlighting. This is in the Groovy syntax, which follows a JSON format. And in case you are wondering, this is a declarative pipeline. This isn't the scripted format of a pipeline. This is the declarative. So if you're looking up syntax for this, make sure you're checking declarative pipelines. Those are the ones that you should be starting out with when getting started with Jenkins. But let's go through this pipeline. There's a couple of things that I want to break down. The first one mentioned before is everything is wrapped in this pipeline parameter, and then the first thing we do is we select the agent that we want this job to run on. So this is very similar to what we set up before to restrict which agent that the build runs on, and we're specifying it based on the label. So for our pipeline, we want to set this to the label of our agent. So I believe that was Docker agent -Python. And now that we have our label selected, the next set of code here is the stages. And within the stages, we have individual stages. So this is a 3-stage pipeline: first to build, next to test, and the last stage is to deliver. So this is good for a test build. Let's go through the steps. So you can see that for the stage build, each stage has steps, and there's 2 steps within each stage. The first step is just doing a basic echo from the Jenkins agent, and then the next step is to just run a shell command, and this is just a placeholder to also echo here, but we're going to be adding in our Linux commands to actually do stuff here. So I hope that makes sense. It's going to make sense as we start running these builds and improving on it. So let's go ahead and hit save. And let's go ahead and build. And then if we go into the build here,
That way.
let's actually go back here. And you can see immediately that the pipeline looks a lot different than just regular builds. You can see here that it's separated into the 3 different stages that we have set: build, test, and deliver. And then you can see that build is green, but test and deliver are red. So it looks like our build failed at the 2nd stage of our pipeline here. Now you can go into the logs of each of these, and it'll tell you exactly what it was doing. So you can see the first thing it did was print the message building, and then it ran our shell script, which just echoes right now.
Excuse me.
Let's go into our test one,
I'm under attack.
and it says testing, and then the shell script fails, and it looks like it's an unterminated coded string. So that should be easy enough to fix. Let's go into configure, and build is good. It was this one, the test stage. So we'll fix the quotation, and our deliver stage looks okay.
Lights out.
Shopee 33 Grand Fashion Sale. Promo puncak 3 Maret. Nikmati gratis ongkir minimal belanja Rp0. Pasti diskon 50% dan voucher diskon 10.000 setiap jam. 3 Maret, 3 Maret, 3 Maret, 3 Maret.
One step at a time. By all means.
Now, the reason that deliver failed, even though it looked okay, is because test was an upstream stage, and basically if an upstream stage fails, your downstream stages are going to fail as well. So let's go ahead and hit build, and I'll stay on this page this time. And here you can see that it's going through the stages. And since our build is so quick, it just immediately updated. But if you're doing a longer build, you would see sort of like a progress bar. Alright, so that's pretty good. Let's up our game by using a Jenkins file and just improving this pipeline. So I'm going to pull up my Visual Studio Code here. And I'm just going to take this, copy it, paste it, and then just rename it to Jenkins file. And I actually need to fix this quotation here because it was missing. And this should be good enough for our job. But I actually want to improve our job before I upload this to GitHub. And the improvement I want to make is to have Jenkins pull the SCM, which we did with our previous project. And basically this means that Jenkins will reach out to GitHub, and if there's any changes on the repository, it's going to go through the build. So I just looked up the syntax by going through a Stack Overflow article, and this looks like the one that we want. And by the way, this is how most of us DevOps engineers work. It's just searching for what we want on Google and then finding the Stack Overflow article and putting it in. DevOps is just like building Legos. So anyways, this should work. I want it to pull every 5 minutes, actually. So I've just manipulated the parameters so it will pull once every 5 minutes. If there's new code on GitHub, it's going to run the build. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to push it out to GitHub here. Just do my commit.
Yes. I'm under attack.
And then within my actual project, I'll need to convert this. Just get rid of that. And instead of using pipeline script, we want to change this to pipeline script from SCM. We'll say get
drop on me.
We'll snag this repository URL. If you're doing this on your own, make sure to change this to your GitHub URL. And if it's a private repository, you're going to have to use credentials. Mine's public, so this will be fine. And then the script path, we just have it set as Jenkins file, but you can name the Jenkins file anything that you wanted and put it in any directory that you wanted. You just need to make sure that this was up to date. So this should be good. I'm going to go ahead and hit save, and I'm actually just going to trigger this one manually just to get it going. But for future builds, next time we do like git commit and push to GitHub, this build should trigger automatically. So let's just go ahead and make sure the build runs using the Jenkins file. I'm just going to hop right into the console output. So it obtained the Jenkins file from get, so we're looking pretty good here. And I actually forgot to update this, so this job is just going to run forever. Let's go ahead and change my template.
Getting up too soon.
Sorry, not my template, change the actual Jenkins file, and change this to Docker
It's not time yet, mate.
Jenkins, Docker agent Python. Alright, I have the memory of a goldfish. Let's go ahead. These changes look good. I'm going to put it up here. And just go updated Jenkins file. And I'm just going to push this way. Double check GitHub, make sure our changes are there.